Thanks, Tevin. 2 free t-shirts. Parents Against SSFL would like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land that the Santa Susana Field Lab encompasses. The 2,850 acres of land that constitutes SSFL has been utilized by the Ventuño Chumash, the Tongva, Fernando Tatavian Band of Mission Indians, and the indigenous communities for time immemorial. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants and seek meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Jeni's going to go ahead and put in the chat right now. If you haven't had a chance, a really, really amazing article came out today from Reuters about how Boeing created a nature preserve that may also preserve pollution. And it focuses on the Santa Susana Field Lab. And the reporter, Jeni Dowdle, did an amazing job going through all of this complicated data from beginning to where we are today, puts it in very easy to understand terms, and we'll be showing her what she did, the analysis of the numbers we'll be going through also today, but they match, and that's kind of great to see when a very big independent media firm found the same issues that we did. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, we're putting that in the chat. Jeni, were you able to put that in the chat? Great. And please read it and also share. We need to make this go viral. This is the reason why we're all here. These are just some of the families that we've met who are local, who have had cancer. 12 of the children, no, six of the children that we're showing here have already passed away from cancer. We have some that are still in treatment and who are fighting hard. Some who are thankfully either NED or in remission. And this is why it matters, is that we are protecting children from the dangerous contaminants at the Santa Susana Field Lab. My daughter's not on here today on this picture, but she's a 2-time cancer survivor. And I know many of you are parents or have children that you care about in your lives. And it's always good for us to remember why we're doing this. In the Dark of the Valley, if you haven't seen the documentary, that's my daughter there, Grace, when she was right after a bone marrow transplant. It's streaming on Peacock TV. It is also going to be airing this Sunday on MSNBC at 7 p.m. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Denise Duffield, who is the Associate Director for Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. I am Denise Duffield, Associate Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. Our organization has been fighting for the full cleanup of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory for over 30 years. Our mission is to protect public health from nuclear and chemical toxins. And so this is squarely right in the heart of what we do. And I'm just going to talk a brief little bit about Santa Susana site history. Highly recommend watching that documentary if you can. It's also available on MSNBC and NBC apps. If you have Roku or any sort of streaming service, you can find it there. Just look it up. So let's take it away. So the field lab, formerly known as Rocketdyne, was established in the late 40s for rocket testing. In 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission was looking for a site that was remote to do nuclear testing that was believed to be too dangerous to do near populated areas. And even though Santa Susana ranked 5th out of 6th for meteorological safety criteria, it was chosen as the location for the field lab anyway because of its close driving distance to UCLA. Next slide. Right now, of course, population has mushroomed and 700,000 people now live within 10 miles of the Santa Susana Field Lab. And you can see some of the communities there in that, in the image here. Next. The elevation of the field lab is of particular importance. You may be in one of these area communities and never see the site because it is tucked away high above the hills. The elevation is important because gravity brings that contamination down. So whether it is through wind events, carrying contaminated soil or dust very far distances, or rain events, surface water leaving the site, groundwater contamination, and of course, unfortunately, fires. The 2018 Woolsey Fire began at the field lab and burned most of it. There were thousands of rocket engine missile tests that released huge amounts of toxic materials into the air, soil, and water. For example, over 800,000 gallons of toxic chemical trichloroethylene, or TCE, was released into the soil and groundwater. And there were also numerous accidents, spills, and releases in the nuclear part of the site. And this is important. I think a lot of people will hear Santa Susana and they'll hear partial meltdown 1959, and they'll think that was a long time ago. That was one incident. How could it possibly contaminated? But the contamination, particularly the nuclear contamination, was a result of much more than just the meltdown. And so you can see here that you can see the location of the sodium reactor experiment where the meltdown occurred, but there were also radioactive leaks at the radioactive materials handling facility. There were other accidents at 2 other reactors. There was open air burning of radioactive waste, and there were fires in the hot lab where spent nuclear fuel was shipped in from around the country for reprocessing. And this occurred over the period of decades. Hazardous materials, as I mentioned, were also burned in open air pits. In the mid-90s, 2 workers were killed in an explosion caused by the illegal disposal of hazardous materials. The FBI raided SSFL, and the US attorney charged Rocketdyne with 3 felonies, which resulted in the largest environmental fine in California at the time. And you can see here that there were huge plumes of toxic materials that fell out over wide areas. And that's the, oops. I don't know where we are. We went from site history to the waterboard very quickly, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Melissa, to sort of make that segue. You're muted.
Sorry, Denise, I didn't mean to do that so quick to you. This is just a reminder that if you have not already, for everyone watching, the hearing will be August 11th in person and online. Jeni is going to share a link where you can register. It's critically important that the community show up and say why we don't want Boeing's MOU, why it's so dangerous, and how it's going to hurt us and the community. Health studies will be covered by Dr. Dodge, president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles.
Thank you. So again, Denise, and just to give you the history to talk about, the event that most people are aware of is the partial meltdown that occurred 63 years ago. But again, the contamination of the site by both nuclear contaminants and chemicals went on for decades, and has left it really a super fun toxic site to this day. Why are we concerned about this, 63 years later? I think the important things to understand that like the radionuclides and both the chemical contamination, these are very long lasting and they're still present. And as I say, under events of, again, the Woolsey Fire, winds, the rains, et cetera, just as Denise mentioned, these contaminants come off site. They come off site and place the surrounding community at risk. So the other thing about these chemicals is they're actually very stable in the environment. Many of the chemicals in particular just stay and just hang around forever and ever and ever. So they really, we talk about forever chemicals, which is an area of things like fire retardants and things that make certain clothing or certain food wrap materials, et cetera. These forever chemicals, Teflon, that hang around forever. Many of these chemicals, these toxins, are very much in that category. So the risk we know is both on-site and off-site. And so this first slide says here, the effect of radiation exposure to former workers was 6 to 8 times that in their study that then was extrapolated from the atomic bomb survivors. So these were people who were working on site, both from, just during the years, their protracted exposure, their risk was very high. Okay, next slide. So that's on-site. But what about off-site? Well, we've talked about, again, if again, from rain runoff, stormwater runoff to the fire, Woolsey Fire, to major windstorms, it puts the surrounding community at risk. And here was a study, again, done by Dr. Hal Morgenstern, who showed that from 1988 to 1995, the incidence of what we call incident cancers, those cancers that are associated with the contaminants on site, was 60% greater with residents living within a 2-mile range of the Santa Susana Field Lab to those living more than 5 miles. So the local community is very much at risk. And as noted here, some of the cancers are those of the thyroid, upper aerodigestive, that's everything from the throat, esophagus, stomach, bladder, where we excrete those chemicals, and blood and lymph tissues, particularly related to some of the radionuclides. Next slide. So again, within the Boeing's own documents, they have the company's own estimates of the cancer risk from toxic pollution, and we can see here their cancer risk they're showing is significant, and this is in their own studies that they've kind of hidden and come through. So they talk about hazard quotients, et cetera. So and it's interesting. Unfortunately, very often in industry, they talk about acceptable risk. Oh, it's only a risk of 1 in a million, or it's a risk of 1 in 100,000. So, but these risks are incredible. And again, and obviously, if you're a family member, there's no such thing as an acceptable risk. Next slide. So these are some of the radionuclides that we see that have been reported both on-site and off-site. And just briefly, because we're going to focus largely on the chemical contamination, but again, the radionuclides to the body, these things typically look like life-giving elements. Tritium, again, is often gets into the water, again, in the groundwater surrounding, and can be linked to, as it's noted here, developmental problems, reproductive problems, particularly in women of childbearing age, and genetic abnormalities. Radium, when it decays, it forms radon gas, which is inhaled and can cause each of these areas of problems, cancers, lymphomas, bone cancers like leukemias, lymphomas, aplastic anemias. And again, other cancers can occur just from external exposure. And actually, I'll pause. How does the human body being, get exposed to these? Well, many of them, it can be just by external exposure, touch and things like that. They can penetrate through the skin. Others are by inhalation, also by ingestion. So you can get it in many different ways. The next one here, technetium-99, is linked, and what happens, it gets into the food chain and gets very much involved, again, where people will then ingest it, et cetera, and particularly in contaminated food and water. Interestingly enough, technetium-99 has probably one of the longest half-lives. We're going to come back to that, but the half-life of technetium-99 is over 200,000 years. The next element there is just iodine-131. Iodine basically is taken up by the thyroid, where it can just remain iodine, the radioactive form, and for ongoing for years, and it can cause thyroid cancers. It combines with soil and organic materials very easily. Cesium to the body looks like potassium, okay, and it can be basically go throughout the body, and cause cancer potentially in any organ it connects with. And again, often, as it says here, 10 to 30 years after the ingestion or inhalation or absorption, and it's very difficult to clean up from the environment because it flows through everything. And potassium is basically an element in every living being. Strontium-90 is a chemical that's very similar to calcium, and so when it comes into the body, it's deposited where calcium is, and so that's like teeth in babies, again, bones, and therefore it presents a risk of bone cancer, cancer adjacent to bones, and also leukemias. And finally, plutonium is probably among the most toxic element on the planet. A few millionths of an ounce inhaled can cause virtual 100% cancer. And so it can present with cancers and kidney damage. It stays in the body for decades. Next slide. So when it comes to radionuclides, we talk about half-lives. A half-life is how long that it takes for that particular radioisotope to a radionuclide to decay by 1/2. Okay, well, that's 1/2 the potency. Interesting, when we come to the hazardous life of these radionuclides, that's actually 20 half-lives. So strontium-90 and cesium have about a 30-year half-life, but when you extrapolate that as to how long they are dangerous, that's 550 years roughly. Okay, so that's why when we talk about, well, this thing was 63 years ago, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't see it. That's why we realize how dangerous they remain to this day. Plutonium-239, again, which I mentioned, is probably among the most toxic materials on the planet, has a half-life of 24,000 years, which extrapolates then to a hazard of life of 500,000 years, 480,000 years. Again, we can only identify how well mankind has done trying to safeguard anything that we've known in our life and in the history of mankind, let alone trying to safeguard something for 500,000 years. Next slide. So we've talked about this particular site, the Boeing site, is largely chemically toxic, okay? And so with many, and again, many of these are what we call in chemistry and in health sciences, the dirty dozen of chemicals. These are chemicals that are among the most dangerous and deadly on the planet. So first of all, it starts out with TCE. Denise mentioned that, mentioned huge 800,000 gallons going into the groundwater beneath and soil. This again, it originally is a solvent, but the impact on human beings is it impairs the immune system, damages liver and kidney, it impairs fetal development, and actually can cause cardiac disease and even death. And realistically, it is actually also a known carcinogen, okay, particularly to the kidney. Perchlorate interferes with iodine uptake, another element just like the iodine 131, but this one, it actually interferes with uptake into the gland, causing low thyroid. And low thyroid particularly is vulnerable in women of childbearing years and also children, young children. It's terribly toxic with respect to development and mental learning, again, learning abilities, learning disabilities. Dioxins and PCBs are kind of come together, and these are what I would call organic pollutants. They're very carcinogenic. They can cause, as noted, reproductive and developmental issues, immunologic and endocrine side effects. And what happens is they get deposited in fat, okay, in fat, where they can reside and stay for years and years thereafter, causing their problems. They too accumulate in our food system. So animals that might eat contaminated foliage, etc. It then becomes into our food chain, and it also, interestingly enough, has an increased risk of heart disease. So that's for both the dioxins and PCBs, which are terribly, terribly toxic. Lead, again, lead, I do pediatrics, and lead is one of our major contaminants. Typically, we think of lead, with, old-fashioned painting, and particularly in the East Coast, where they use lead paints in the old apartment buildings, et cetera. The one thing I'll just say is lead is one of those levels, just like radionuclides. There is no safe level of lead exposure. Every level affects something, okay? And so as noted here, it's tremendous, particularly in pediatrics, causing learning disabilities for women, infertility, cancers, and also increased risk of cardiac events. So a very nasty element, again, and again, no safe level. Next slide. So this shows some of the heavy metals and some of these toxins we just talked about found in the rainwater runoff after the Santa Susana Field Lab. And there were 57 exceedances of allowable levels in basically from November 2018 through spring of 19. So in that basically 5-month period, there are 57 exceedances in the storm runoff from the field lab. And this just shows some of those. Okay, and I don't necessarily have to belabor, but again, many of them, when you talk about there is no safe level, lead is in there, et cetera. Well, it's 17 times the acceptable level. Iron, gross alpha, basically what gross alpha is that's the overall radioactivity, So again, so when we're looking there, it was 4 times the limit. Well, there was a major study done by the National Academy of Sciences called the BEER-7 study. Well, that stands for the biologic effects of ionizing radiation. And that study said there is no safe level of radioactive exposure. Every level above background puts the community at an increased risk of cancer. Every level, no safe level. So why would you ever want to accept a level above background? Okay, obviously we can't reduce below background, but anything above that needs to be cleaned up, which is what we're talking about from the get-go on this site. Next slide. I think that's me. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Dodge. You're on fire. I love it. So much good energy. This is Jeni Knack. She will be presenting about the what used to be the existing cleanup agreements, and she's with Parents Against Santa Susana Field Lab.
Great. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't registered yet, there are links in the chat to register for the Waterboard's MOU hearing, Memorandum of Understanding, where we are going to be talking about the cleanup agreements being broken. So we would like you to go ahead and register, join us in person or online at 10 a.m. on August 11th. We can send you text updates letting you know when they start receiving public comments, so you don't have to sit around waiting. We're happy to help make that process as painless as possible, but we need you to participate. Next slide. So there are two cleanup agreements at the site. The first one we'll go over as it pertains to the settlement agreement is the 2007 consent order. Agreements to remediate SSFL complied with environmental laws to match existing open space zoning areas, which includes agricultural or rural residential land use. The agricultural rural residential based cleanup standards were almost as protective as the 2010 AOC cleanup agreements to background until those standards were drastically weakened in the settlement agreement, which Dan will go over next. But now they more closely resemble the former recreator standards, which were far less stringent and less health protective. The 2007 consent order required the cleanup of soil contamination to be completed by 2017. That's now 5 years ago. And also by that time, a requirement for a permanent groundwater remedy to be in place in that document. Boeing, NASA, and the Department of Energy all signed the 2007 consent order with the state's Department of Toxic Substances Control. All three responsible parties signed that agreement. Next slide. This looks like a very happy picture of our hard-won and fought 2010 administrative order on consent, that cleanup agreement. That must have been a very happy day. It was a very stringent health protective cleanup. We've got Supervisor Parks, I believe the Teens for Toxins, if I'm not mistaken, Congressmember Sherman. It was a great day for cleanup advocates. Next slide. That 2010 administrative order on consent was signed between the state's toxic agency, Department of Energy, and NASA to clean up their portions of the property back to background. As Dr. Dodge was mentioning, background means the level of contamination that was existing on the site before the site was degraded by the responsible parties. Also, in the 2010 agreement, that dictated that all the debris go to a licensed low-level radioactive waste site, not set to a regular recycling site where workers would unknowingly come into contact with that debris and that contamination. Again, the 2010 agreement was to be completed 5 years ago by 2017. Unlike the 2007 agreement, Boeing did not sign the 2010 agreement. They only signed the 2007 agreement. Next slide. The most important part of this is that these agreements not only were extremely health protective, but they were legally binding. They were enforceable by the state for all the contamination to be cleaned up by 2017. All three responsible parties, NASA, Boeing, and the Department of Energy, have all resisted in complying with both of these agreements. Next slide. The 2010 AOC agreement was one of the most health protective and comprehensive cleanup agreements in the American history. And that's why it's so sad that the settlement agreement has been created. Next slide, please. Our communities have supported this, widespread support throughout the city surrounding the site, but also there has been widespread explicit, written, and verbal support from 7 cities surrounding the site, including the city of Los Angeles, 2 senators, 7 Congress members, state senators, assembly persons, 5 county supervisors have all supported these legally binding cleanup agreements. Slide. In addition, there are environmental and social justice groups and non-governmental organizations that join us in wanting the 2007 and 2010 cleanup agreements honored and implemented. Some of these organizations you see here are represented as panelists on today's town hall. But as the days pass and we learn more about the MOU agreement and the settlement agreement, more organizations are joining us in opposition to those agreements because they realize that their mission statements and the organizations and people that they serve, the communities they serve, can potentially be affected if the contamination on the site is not remediated for generations to come. It will continue to migrate and impact the health of people in the surrounding communities. I think we're handing it over to Dan.
Hi. So you've just heard that there were 2 agreements legally binding that would require essentially cleaning up the mess that was made at Santa Susana, the radioactive contamination and the chemical contamination. And those agreements, which were hard fought and widely supported, were supposed to have the site fully cleaned up by 2017. We're 5 years later, and the promised cleanup hasn't even occurred. We're going to show you about a backdoor, dirty deal between the Newsom administration and one of the biggest polluters in the country, the Boeing Company, that was signed about 2 months ago. And we're going to show you what you can still do about it because the agreement hasn't taken effect yet. They still need one more step. And you, if you're willing, by testifying, by speaking, and we can help you as you work through what you would say at the hearing, there is a chance that we can still save that cleanup. So give me the next slide and I'll try to explain to you what this agreement is about. You can just, this is California Environmental Protection Agency Secretary Jared Blumenfeld at a meeting in February of 2020, making some promises. Some of you may have been there. You can just play this. We need the volume. I'm not hearing it.
Just a sec, let me see if I have to do something to share. We had this problem before. Share computer sound. Okay, I'm going to start that over.
We don't have a lot of tolerance for having a negotiation. All the meetings that I go to, like, are we opening up the consent order? The answer is no. Are we opening up the order on consent, which I'll talk through in a minute? And the answer is no.
And then again.
We don't have a lot of tolerance for having.
No, you go to the next one.
We don't have a lot of tolerance.
That's rather annoying, isn't it? Hold on.
I've had the same problem. You simply have to click it twice to get to the next tape. There you go.
That's one way to do it. Do you want this one?
I want the second, third, and fourth.
So these entities, Boeing in 2007, Department of Energy and NASA in 2010, entered into agreements. Those are legally binding agreements. We will hold them to those agreements. And as I said, but I will say it again, our job is to regulate, not to negotiate.
Did you hear that? Our job is to regulate, not to negotiate. And you can advance to the next slide.
What we have in front of us, which I'll describe, is agreements, and we're really not here to negotiate. This is not negotiation, this is about implementation. So once someone's agreed to something, a price of a house, a job contract, you kind of expect people to be good to their word and to do it.
And
what we have in front of really, my goal has been to change and improve, I would say, the culture of the Department of Toxic Substance Control. They are the regulator. The regulator means they set the cleanup standards. This is not a ongoing negotiation with the polluters. The polluters have a role, they have to pay for it, and they have to adhere to the standards that we have.
So 4 times, at least, during that meeting in February 2020, Secretary Blumenfeld promised, volunteered, that our job is to regulate, not to negotiate. There are not going to be any negotiations with Boeing. We're going to enforce the 2007 order that it signed. However, less than a year later, you can see Jared's name on the upper left-hand corner. A letter was sent by the state to Boeing offering to enter into non-binding confidential mediation with Boeing to negotiate. Less than a year after he promised there'd be no negotiations, they initiated those negotiations secretly. Next slide, please. Ooh. Okay. And when that became public, that there were negotiations, DTSC director, the Toxics Agency director, Williams, wrote that the purpose of the negotiations was simply to enforce the 2007 consent order, that those were legally binding documents, and these DTSC will use its authority to ensure compliance, and that the mediation has to be consistent with the 2007 order. So they broke their word about negotiations, and then when that became public, they said that the negotiations were to enforce the agreement. Next slide. However, when Senator Padilla and 4 Congress people wrote expressing concern that DTSC was considering changing the standardized risk assessment methodology, that's the key document that determines the cleanup standards, and indicating again their strong support for the cleanup agreements, that they should be vigorously enforced and urgently so. In the next slide, you'll see that Director Williams wrote back again pledging that they would hold Boeing accountable to the 2007 consent order. However, as you'll see in the next slide, when they issued the 796-page agreement, the secret deal with Boeing, they conceded that it superseded significant sections of the 2007 order. So the negotiations weren't about carrying out the order, but superseding it. They substituted a 700+ page agreement for what had been a 30 or so page order. And in the process, they weakened the cleanup tremendously. As you'll see in the next slide, this is DTSC, the Toxics Agency's summary, a matrix of some of the changes they've made to the 2007 order. And next, even so, they had promised that any proposal coming from the settlement will include opportunities for public input. And yet, as you'll see next, when they entered into the agreement on May 9th, a couple months ago, they said that they agreed that there would be no hearing or any further action before this agreement becomes effective. DTSC signed, Boeing signed, but there was no public comment allowed, no public review, no environmental review, and no opportunity for input by LA County, LA City, Ventura County, the affected jurisdictions that have long supported the full cleanup. And next, please. They issued a press release on May 9th when they signed the agreement. And the very first sentence in the release said that this was a major development to strengthen the cleanup of contaminated soil, groundwater, and stormwater runoff, and that it establishes strict cleanup protocols. So the question is, after all the lies you've just seen, Secretary Blumenfeld promising there'd be no negotiations when they were, then them saying that there would be public input allowed and not allowing that, and when they said the negotiations were solely to carry out the 2007 agreement and then the new agreement, in fact, superseding it. Here's an interesting question which we can empirically check whether they're telling the truth. They say that the agreement strengthens the cleanup. Well, let's take a look at whether that is the case. Next. Nowhere in the agreement or the press statements about it is any comparison between the new cleanup standards adopted under this agreement, the deal, the secret backroom deal, and the requirements that have been previously in effect under the 2007 order. We've reviewed the changes. I'll show you in a minute that review. And the numbers show that the new numbers are scores of times weaker, hundreds of times weaker, and even thousands of times weaker, depending on the toxic chemical and its location. They're allowing, in other words, hundreds and thousands of times higher concentrations than before this backroom deal. Next. So here you need a microscope to be able to read the numbers, but this is one of several pages in the agreement showing the new cleanup standards for these very toxic chemicals. And I want to make clear, these are the second column that's colored, is the supposed best cleanup. The agreement says that they can do much worse than that, but let's compare that second column, which is supposedly a resident with a backyard garden, to what they had in the next page, which is the previous levels. They didn't think anyone would check the numbers. Nowadays, to save your life, you've got to check the numbers. And when you check the numbers, as you'll see in the next slide, you find that those risk-based screening levels, the starting point for cleanup standards, for polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, very toxic chemicals, have been weakened by a factor of 20. And the dioxins have similarly been weakened by a factor of 20. You compare the recent agreement against the earlier agreement, and we've got a 20-fold weakening. But then, as you'll see next, it gets worse than that. Buried in the document, they add a multiplier of 5 for additional weakening of the cleanup standards for some parts of the Boeing areas, and a multiplier of 100 for the rest of the Boeing areas. So you've got risk-based screening levels that are already 20 times weaker than they should be. But then they multiply that 20-fold weakening by 5 for a 100-fold weakening, and other locations, they multiply the 20-fold weakening by a factor of 100 for a 2,000-fold weakening. And I'll show you that in a minute now. Next. So they took a 5 times multiplier of the promised cancer risk level, which is supposed to be 1 in a million, and they're allowing that to be multiplied by 5, and you'll see next where. So in this map, you see area 1 to the right, you see area 3 to the left. Those are Boeing controlled areas that are part of this agreement. And the yellow and green areas we'll discuss in a moment, but the areas that are not yellow and green in area 1 that are kind of marked gray, those are the areas where there's a 5-fold multiplier on top of the factor 20. Next. But for any area that they claim to have a moderate level of biological features, they say they're going to leave in place anything with a 100-fold multiplier over the risk-based screening levels. They say they will leave it in place if the risk is less than 10 to the minus 4, when the promised cleanup level for the risk-based screening level was 10 to the minus 6 or 1 in a million. So this is an additional factor of 100 weakening, a get out of jail free card for them that's hard to conceive of. Next. So all those areas that are yellow and green, those areas would be allowed an additional 100-fold weakening of the cleanup standards. Ironically, to the extent that there are wildlife or vegetation of importance in those areas, and many of them have been stripped bare, this is where the rocket test stands were and so on. These are the areas in which they're going to allow the greatest level of contamination. The sensitive critters will be exposed to 100 times higher levels of contamination than the risk-based screening levels. They're basically frying the ecological creatures and using them as an excuse for not cleaning up the site. Next. So, as I said, the risk-based screening levels were weakened by a factor of 20, and then they used a 5-fold multiplier for some parts of the site and a 100-fold for others. So that means that overall, for many of the chemicals, they're allowing 100 times higher levels of contamination, or 2,000 times higher levels. If it was doubling or tripling, it would be bad enough, but this is 100-fold and 2,000-fold higher levels of contamination. Next. So here you can see, again, for the PCBs and the dioxins, that in the yellow and green areas on that map, the cleanup standards has been weakened by roughly a factor of 2,000 for the PCBs and dioxins. And for the minority of the area, those that were marked gray, it's about 100-fold weakening. Absolutely staggering. And if they were proud of this, they would have told us. But instead, they claimed that they had made the cleanup standards more stringent. You will see that that is in fact a lie, like these other statements they had made, and that they are making it far less stringent, far less protective. Next. Now they got some cover for this because they also said they'll clean up the radionuclides in the soil to background. But next, you'll see that the areas we're talking about are the Boeing areas. And those areas didn't do nuclear work. Those areas were primarily dealing with chemicals. Contamination in the Area 1 and Area 3 areas that we're talking about in this agreement is largely toxic chemicals. So this was a nice diversion. You'll see next that the radioactive work was done in the orange area, Area 4, the Department of Energy area. That's where the meltdown occurred and the other reactor accidents. Even there, they have a fair amount of chemical contamination. So although they're saying that in the Area 1 and Area 3, the radionuclides will be cleaned up to background, the chemicals will not. And the chemical standards are being dramatically weakened. Next. So even if they were to clean up, as they were saying, to the garden, residential with garden, they've redefined the residential with garden to be hundreds or thousands of times weaker than it had been before this agreement. But here they're telling us that the agreement says that even that can be weakened, that the agreement simply says that the standard could be as stringent as a resident with garden exposure scenario. That means they have the option, which they are almost certainly will use, of cleaning up to numbers that are even weaker than the ones I've just shown you. Next. So there are all sorts of different standards. What Boeing had wanted, it had promised to clean it up so it would be safe for a resident with garden or a farmer. In other words, to be safe enough that those of you who live near the site would be safe. Those who have farming activity near the site would be safe. Boeing promised that and then broke its word. And then it said what it wanted to do was clean up to a recreator standard, where you're only having to protect someone based on the assumption they'd only be there for a few hours every other week or so. And so you'll see next that what they actually have done is Orwellian. Boeing said they want to use a recreator standard. DTSC promised that they would enforce the requirement for residential. So in the secret negotiations, all that happened is that DTSC caved, capitulated, and it ended up agreeing to redefine the resident with garden risk-based screening levels so that they're almost identical to the old recreator standard that Boeing always wanted. So these 1,000-fold changes got Boeing to where it had wanted to be from the beginning. Extraordinarily weak cleanup standards, breaking the agreement that they had signed in 2007 and the commitment to clean up the site. Next, please. You should also know that Cal EPA and DTSC forfeited the right to go to court to enforce the agreement. This provision says that if there's any disagreement about Boeing's conduct, and I don't know why there would be because Boeing got everything it wanted to under this agreement, but if there were any disagreement, rather than going to court, DTSC would have to go back to the same mediator. And if that didn't provide the result, they would then go to a panel of 3 referees. Boeing gets to pick one of them, and DTSC the second, and then Boeing and DTSC's persons pick the third. They can't go to court, however. Next. And at the core of the agreement is that the state has agreed that no matter how much contamination is found, Boeing won't have to clean up more than a small percentage of the contaminated soil. This produces a cap on top of how much Boeing will have to clean up. And our best estimate is that only a few % of the contaminated soil will get cleaned up if this agreement is allowed to go forward. the vast majority of the contaminated soil will remain where that contamination can migrate off-site and put at risk you and your families and your loved ones. Next, please. So I just want to remind you, I fought this for more than 40 years. A number of the people on the call have fought this hard for years. We're at an absolute turning point. This agreement would undo everything we worked for. It would place at risk those hundreds of thousands of people who live near the site in perpetuity, because the contamination at the source would never get cleaned up. It would continue to migrate off-site. There's one little wrinkle. The agreement between the Toxics Agency and Boeing can't take effect unless the Waterboard approves a related Memorandum of Understanding. They're going to hold a hearing on August 11th. You, by speaking, and we can help you as you try to figure out how to say what you want to say. Don't get nervous about this. It's only 2 or 3 minutes, and you can do it remotely or you can come. It's very important to come if you can, but it's fine to do it remotely if you can't. If enough people speak out loud and clear, we may get sufficient votes in that Waterboard to turn down the MOU, and then the agreement itself can't take effect. So I urge you, if you care about this, to once again sign up so we can be in touch with you, and to be prepared on August 11th to speak in opposition to the Memorandum of Understanding. And now I take it, I hand it over. Is that right? To Jeff.
Thanks, Dan. And this is Jeff. Jeff, you're muted right now. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi. So I'm Jeff Rook. I'm the Pacific Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, which has a mercifully pronounceable acronym of PEER. And you're going to hear a lot of acronyms because what's being done here by Boeing is sort of a complicated shadow dance to sort of confuse. So you just heard a critique, a dissection of the cleanup agreement, which is basically of the soil, between the Department of Toxic Substances Control and Boeing. There's a separate matter, which is sort of the trigger, that involves the water discharge permit, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or basically water pollution permit that Boeing also holds. And the best we can figure, the reason that Boeing made the two contingent upon each other was that Boeing got greedy, that they want to represent to their shareholders in the SEC and others that they've reached a global settlement and they can walk away from this multi-billion-dollar liability for pennies on the dollar. And the only part of this that's subject to any sort of public review is the tail on the dog, which is the MOU. But the MOU is connected to the dog. So I'd like to make 3 very brief points. One is that the Memorandum of Understanding is based upon basically a flawed premise. The notion behind the MOU between the Water Quality Control Board for LA and Boeing is that if Boeing goes through with a settlement agreement, there won't be any pollution left. And because there won't be any pollution left, there'll be nothing to run off the site, and therefore there'll be no need for a water pollution permit, and it can be rescinded. And you may find in the course of the hearing on the 11th, the water boards say, boy, we can't talk about the soil cleanup. We're not responsible for the soil cleanup. We only do water pollution. But the MOU itself makes it quite clear. It says the remediation of contaminated soil specifically is pertinent to the MOU. The two are joined together. And so the notion that this settlement agreement is going to result in the elimination of all pollution that would create contaminated runoff is frankly absurd. So you've just heard that the cleanup is limited to, in this case, the removal of 444,000 cubic yards of soil total on this huge site. That the cleanup standards allow, by their own terms, levels admitted to cause observable adverse effects to wildlife and fauna. It's a fairly absurdly low standard. And as you also just heard, the health standards are watered down by several hundreds, in some cases, thousands of times. And so the notion that there will not be enough pollution left on this site to create any sort of toxic runoff relies upon kind of a form of magical thinking. Yet that's the position that the board is being asked to approve. The second thing is, you look at the MOU itself, is that it requires that the board, the LA Regional Board, basically to suspend all of its independent judgment. They must rely upon the provisions, but by decisions of the Surface Water Expert Panel, the expert panel which is chosen and paid for by Boeing. And so this panel will determine under this MOU, what are the background values? What are the post-cleanup scenario modeling? What is the post-cleanup confirmation stormwater modeling? What is the post-soil cleanup stormwater human health risk assessment that results in the conclusion that no unacceptable health risk to human receptors from exposure to groundwater will result from the Boeing area post-cleanup status? So it's not clear what remedy, if any, the LA Water Board would have if it disagreed with the Boeing experts' conclusions. But it does appear to put the state of California in a position where the polluter is put in charge of monitoring its own compliance and the need for any further corrective measures, which is no wonder why Boeing called this a win-win proposition. Then the other issue is Boeing's not the sole operator on the site. There are two federal entities, the Department of Energy and NASA. And as you heard, at least the Department of Energy one may have the problem with radionuclides that Boeing doesn't have. So the MOU provides that Boeing's permit will be rescinded when the other two entities get their own permits, or failing to get their own permits, Boeing will have exercised its best efforts to persuade them to get permits. So now you think to yourself, why would these two entities want to subject itself to regulation voluntarily? And the other issue about all this is these lands are sort of adjoined to each other. As the MOU points out, due to the topography of the SFFL, the Santa Susana, stormwater can carry pollutants from one area of the site to the other, and therefore impact the quality of stormwater discharge from the Boeing area, NASA area, and DOE area. So the idea that by Boeing doing this cleanup in one part of the site, the rest of the site is sort of magically cleaned up, the pollutants never mix, they don't run in together, you can't trace who's responsible for what, yet the only thing that's clear is that Boeing will be able to walk away. Creates kind of a regulatory nightmare where all these parties will be pointing at each other, trying to figure out who's responsible. And in the meantime, Boeing will be able to walk away. Once Boeing concludes its cleanup, there's no mechanism for determine what portion of the polluted runoff will be ascribed to DOE or NASA. How do you decide between the two? That's not Boeing's problem. That will be apparently the Waterboard's problem. And who's going to pay for all the analyses before there's even a permit to figure out what needs to be permitted? That's not at all provided for either. So taking a step back in this whole thing, this is described as a memorandum of understanding. And frankly, it's more of a memorandum of misunderstanding. Like the settlement agreement, it allows Boeing the ability to go to file appeals, to get judicial review, which the Waterboard doesn't have. But why in a memorandum of understanding would you need to have judicial review? The other part about this is that this pollution discharge control permit is supposed to be based upon science and actual measurements of what is going on in the site, what is running off, what could run off, what may run off. The MOU is completely absent of any kind of scientific determination. The only thing it provides is that the Boeing experts will determine when there's complete compliance and Boeing is no longer responsible. The third point is that, as Dan pointed out, when the state unveiled its settlement agreement on the soil cleanup in May, there was no public hearing, there was no review. I think there was a kind of a controlled press conference. And this upcoming board hearing is going to be the only opportunity for any sort of public comment or review, but it's sort of set up in a way that is really artificial and tends to limit the comments, and a lot of the underlying issues about the quality of the settlement agreement itself are beyond the expertise of the Water Board. And so the Water Board would be remiss if it did not order a separate public review session with DTSC for all of these matters to be explained, for them to answer questions, for them to provide the information so it can all be independently verified. Failing that, this is a pig in a poke.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm going to go back and share my screen. Hold on. Here we go. I'm going to talk through the MOU just a little bit further with just a little bit more detail. And again, with everything that Jeff just shared with us is why this whole deal stinks, right? From the settlement agreement through the MOU. And but the reason why it matters to us, beside it just being obviously a corrupt deal, is that it reaches the people who live in the community, like me and my family, like Jeni, like many of you who are watching. This is actually from the NPDES, that's the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. Thank God we can just call it NPDES, which is still a mouthful. But essentially, it's companies like Boeing. It's a permit that allows them to legally contaminate waterways, which just seems crazy that even in the 20th century, companies are still allowed to legally pollute waterways, knowingly, intentionally, but at least it's limited and measured and monitored. That's what Boeing's trying to get rid of. They're trying to get out of having an NPDES permit. But I thought this was especially interesting and somewhat terrifying that the SSFL has the potential to discharge approximately 187 million gallons of stormwater runoff a day that could be contaminated with pollutants from the SSFL. And the thing that makes this so significant, as we'll see, is that the Santa Susana Field Lab, because it's on that hill, it is also the headwaters of the Los Angeles River. It also flows down into the Cayugas Creek watershed. And that's incredibly important. And that's why the Water Board's involvement is so important, to make sure that the contamination isn't overwhelming these waters. Here you'll see that this is the Cayugas Creek watershed. So if you live in Moore Park, Simi Valley, Thousand Oaks, Camarillo, Oxnard, and down into Port Hueneme, that is the watershed that is being impacted on Ventura County side. It's the LA River, Dayton, Bell Creek, and I forget the other one. We'll come back to it. There's an LA side, and then on the back side, it drains down into Ventura County. And when it drains down into Ventura County, and Jeni, feel free to jump in anytime, it is not being treated at all. It is directly running off of the SSFL during heavy rains. And much of the population in that watershed relies upon groundwater for drinking, according to the NPDES permit, proposed permit. Now, this is a little technical, but you guys will get this. I'm not worried. All the little numbers here, those are called outfalls. And an outfall is like a little science station set up to measure how much contamination is in the rainwater runoff. So every time it rains, these little outfalls switch on, and they are measuring. Well, it's not every time, actually. It's a lot less than every time. It should be every time. That would make sense. But of course, with Boeing involved, it's not going to make sense. So it's not every time. But when they do take measurements, these are the places that they take measurements from. And you can see that some of these, like 3, 4, 10, and 9, they drain into the Arroyo Simi, which goes right past the 2 drinking wells used by Golden State Water customers, which includes every school in Simi Valley, I believe, is on Golden State Water. And that's going down into the Cayugas Creek watershed, which will eventually go down all the way to the Pacific Ocean near Point Mugu. Then some of these will go into unlined ponds where that contaminated water is allowed to percolate into the groundwater, which is incredibly dangerous. don't know if we have the quote here or not, but from the NPDES, we learned that groundwater is exceptionally costly, difficult, and takes centuries to clean. So the fact that they're taking the contaminated soil, right? It's mixing in with that rainwater. It's making this mud of contaminated, dirty water, and then it goes into Silvernail Pond because it's routed there intentionally. And then it leaks down, it seeps down into the groundwater where that contamination is going to be exceptionally difficult to clean up. And now we're essentially passing on the contamination of the SSFL onto future generations for them to have to deal with, again, affecting groundwater, drinking water, waters used to irrigate crops, recreation, and the Pacific Ocean. On the other side, you can see these blue and green outfalls, number 18, 8, 11, 1, 19, and 2. I don't know if 19 does work. Is draining down into Bell Creek and Dayton Creek. And these are the headwaters of the Los Angeles River. And again, the Los Angeles River isn't going to just impact people who play in the river, which because of the LA River Revitalization Project, people now kayak, they fish in the LA River, they eat the fish that they catch there. This is also on the dry days is evaporating, and it's going to leave some of that contamination behind, some of the radionuclides like Dr. Dodge spoke of that can last 24,000 years in just their half-life. Some of the long-lasting, what we call forever chemicals, those remain after the water evaporates. Well, now you have contaminants loose in the dry LA riverbed that can get blown around, and now people can inhale them, and it can go into the food system. It can move around. And so what I'm trying to explain is that this is not limited to people who are playing directly in the water in LA River, and it's not limited to even just Golden State Water customers. The potential for contamination to reach the public through the rain runoff is significant and long lasting. And so that's a big part of why Boeing doesn't want to have an NPDES in place, because then they actually have to be held accountable for how much contamination is reaching the community. Again, this is talking about how the contaminants from SSFL go to Bell Creek, and it was detected. We'll see that that happened more than just once. Golden State Water, which is the water that Jeni and her family comes into her home. And because of that, Jeni does not drink the tap water. She has water sent to her home so that way she can lower her risk of being exposed. Because even though Golden State Water mixes their water from the Niles well and the Sycamore well, which are only a few miles away from the Santa Susana Field Lab, they don't test as thoroughly as they could. And the confidence for customers of Golden State Water is very low that they are drinking safe water. Jeni, you look like you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I would just like to add, because we didn't add it into the slides, but the district engineer for the Division of Drinking Water, I think it was 2019, shared in a presentation I believe the Simi Valley City Council, that at times Golden State Water uses up to 67% of well water from those two wells in the residential drinking water blend. That's a lot. And I am not suggesting that that water is always contaminated, but the EPA has stated that the water from those wells does have the potential to take contaminated water from underneath SSFL into our drinking water. And so if it isn't remediated and they remove the infrastructure on that site to just flow off, the actual, from my understanding, they're rerouting the water on site to avoid paying fines that are now in place. But as soon as they remove the NPDES permit, there won't be any more fines, so they don't have to keep the water from running off. And so there might be potential for more contamination to be coming off site.
And this again is why Boeing doesn't want an NPDES, and that's why they want the MOU proposal to be passed, because then they could sidestep all of this. They wouldn't ever be held accountable for it again. These are, sorry, there we go. Since 2002, I believe, I don't remember when Boeing first got their NPDES, but you can see all the different violations. This is not one violation per year. This is hundreds of violations over the last 2 decades. Each time Boeing swore up and down that they would never, ever have an exceedance, which means the time that they exceeded the legal limits of how much contamination is allowed to be in the water for each chemical. After the Woolsey Fire, we saw 57 violations just in 2 quarters. They put in mitigation measures that lowered the amount of contamination coming off in the rainwater, but to date they still have exceedances all the time. So we know that this is happening. It's not hypothetical, that the contamination is reaching the community. I'm sorry. If the MOU is approved and the agreement, settlement agreement is implemented, again, like Dan said, if they do the settlement agreement, it's approximately 1% of the contaminated soil will be remediated. 99% of the contaminated soil will be left in place. And then Boeing would not be testing for how much contamination is still in the rainwater runoff. As Jeff mentioned, they would be using something called modeling. They would be, between that and the expert water panel that is paid by Boeing, if you watch the documentary, you'll see them. They would assume that all contamination is gone. So therefore they would assume that it would be safe to take away these best management practices. And these best management practices are what Jeni was just mentioning. They are procedures and their berms and their structures that have been built that try to limit how much contamination is coming off in the rainwater. So there's all the contamination at the SSFL is pretty much loose. That's what makes it so dangerous. It's not, sometimes when we think of radioactive contamination or chemical contamination, we think of these giant barrels kind of glowing green buried underneath the ground. That's actually not what's going on at the Santa Susana Field Lab. This is a result of spills and accidents and releases and fires and explosions, and it's loose in the soil and it's loose in the groundwater, and it's very easy to migrate. It's able to move around. And so because there's so much contaminated soil and it's mixing in whenever it rains, that soil becomes mobile and able to move. So Boeing built these structures. These are 2 pictures actually from the SSFL of how they're trying to keep some of that contaminated rainwater from getting into the community. But as Jeni said, and I believe Jeff also, according to the MOU, even these measures, which haven't stopped all the contamination, these would be removed. So we would actually expect potentially more contamination to come off site if the MOU is passed. However, we wouldn't know it because they won't be measuring it anymore, because there won't be an NPDES. There will be nothing there to monitor to see how much contamination is coming off site. This is the Waterboard who will be voting. You can see underneath Lawrence Yee was recently the chair. He has possibly been forced to resign very recently. A few weeks ago, he has stepped down. We believe from what we've heard that might be related to the Santa Susana Field Lab, because this, obviously there's a lot of political pressure. And word was that he may have been sympathetic to what we've been sharing and showing, or that he may have criticized the way that the Waterboard was interacting with the DTSC without public input. He is no longer going to be able to vote. Irma Munoz is still on the board. If you have heard any of our other webinars and town halls that we've hosted, she has had to recuse herself. And we hope that you guys will really be paying attention during the MOU hearing. If she doesn't recuse herself for this hearing, we need to throw a fit. We need to shut the meeting down, because she has accepted money from Boeing through her nonprofit. A Attorney General inquiry, California General inquiry has been started to see if that actually amounts to bribery, if she accepted bribes or not. She needs to not be voting. She has conflict of interest potentially. Charles Stringer will not be there because he resigned, I believe in 2022. Dan, please feel free to correct me if not. But he was formerly a Boeing lobbyist. And the reason why I included him here is to understand that at least two of these people on the board, Irma and Charles, who is no longer on the board, have directly taken money from Boeing at some point in their careers. They have been influenced. And if this was not a big deal to Boeing, I don't know why they would have two people on the board who have taken money from them. And again, the fact that the expert panel is paid by Boeing, and as we'll hear from Tevin, there has been some extreme greenwashing happening from Boeing. Their commitment into this and the way that they're this interested in the MOU should be a giant red flag for us in the public. If they've gone through this much trouble to try to get this MOU passed, we can guarantee there's a good reason. And we've shown you those good reasons. But for me, this is also kind of like independent confirmation. If they're this concerned, there's a reason for it. There's a massive amount of money for them on the line right now. And there is a massive amount of children at risk. That it is our job as community members and parents and grandparents and family members to protect our community and to protect our children. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tevin, with a watershed scientist with the Wishtoyo Shumash Foundation.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you for the acknowledgement at the top, but I'd like to make it again, just acknowledging that the Santa Susana Field Laboratory and many of us are on either Chumash or Fernandino Tatavian lands, or acknowledge that we're in that space. And then moving on, I'd like to thank all of the people who've spoken tonight and given your time. Let's jump into it. Talking about LA River and Cayugas Creek watersheds. As Melissa discussed before, contaminants found at Santa Susana Field Laboratory drain into tributaries of both the LA River and Cayugas Creek. On the south side, it drains into Bell Canyon Creek, which is a tributary of the LA River. On the north side, it drains into a really small ephemeral creek that drains into the Arroyo Cini. The Arroyo Cini is a massive tributary for Cayugas Creek, and Cayugas Creek flows into the Pacific Ocean at Magoo Naval Base. Dr. Dodge touched on this. Just from my quick looks through all of the monitoring reporting that Boeing has to do through their NPDES program, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. That's their Clean Water Act permit they get to the regional board. They have to post monitoring reports that are publicly available. And in those, you can actually see that every single time it rains, they have exceedances, which means that they're violating their permit. They're violating the Clean Water Act. They're violating 401. I responded to Councilwoman Luvanos, who asked if we could sue. I think you could. I think someone could bring a citizen suit against Boeing for violation of the 401 of the Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. But you would have to prove that the regulatory agency, the regional board, is not actually regulating or enforcing the Clean Water Act in this case. Sorry about that. All right, moving on. Got a little sidetracked there, but wanted to answer a question right off the bat. Many of the pollutants flowing into these waters are carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, mutagens, and teratogens. These watersheds provide essential habitat for wildlife, water for crops, especially Cayugas Creek. Cayugas Creek flows through the Oxnard Plain. A lot of folks have water rights. A lot of farms and agricultural areas have water rights to Cayugas Creek, and they pump water out of it. So if you guys have had a strawberry ever in your life, chances are it might have been watered with water that came from or was polluted by SSFL. These watersheds provide essential habitat. Okay, so sorry, already hit that point. But on top of water for our crops, these watersheds are also really important for natural cultural resources and recreational opportunities. This picture on this slide is actually some folks, looks like 3 people kayaking through the LA River. Yes, this is the LA River. There are some parts that have been beautifully restored and are really great areas to recreate. All right, next slide. All right, I wanted to hit some historical chemicals that are found at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. All these chemicals have been found at SSFL, but Boeing's NPDES permit does not require them to monitor for any of these pollutants. So this means Boeing may be discharging these harmful pollutants without any requirement to monitor or restrict their discharge. It also means that they don't have to put this in those monitoring reports that I mentioned before. So if they don't know about it, then we don't know about it, right? Or if they're not monitoring for it, then we don't know about it in those publicly available reports. Kind of scary, especially since we know they've been there before. All these chemicals are on the national recommended water quality criteria, specifically the aquatic life criteria table. All these chemicals are harmful to aquatic life. These pollutants are acutely toxic to wildlife and plants. They cause a variety of cancers, harm to reproductive organs, and reduce immune system capacity. Next slide. All right, big bonus points for everybody who knew what this guy was right off the bat. You're a fellow Erper. This is a arroyo toad, one of the endangered species in the area, one of my favorites. I've managed to see a few of them in my life, and I'm pretty excited that they're still kicking. But we've got to talk, more some more dark stuff here. So pervasive contaminants and impacts to the food web. Contaminants found at SSFL are known to depress invertebrate populations and inhibit essential functions of photosynthesis and plant life. So what did I just say? Depressing invertebrate populations. So this is like insects, spiders, all the stuff we're kind of like scared of, right? But like it's also like really essential food for a ton of different things. And then a lot of these contaminants also really harm plants that produce seeds and vegetative matter. Rodents, reptiles, amphibians, small birds all rely on seeds, leaves, fruit, and abundant invertebrate populations for the majority of their sustenance. Impacts to these lower trophic groups. Impacts to these lower trophic groups have dramatic impacts to meso and apex predators through decreased food supply and biomagnification and bioaccumulation of contamination. Want to talk about like so ground level ecology here. So a trophic group is like a kind of where you're at in the great big like food chain of life, right? So lower trophic levels are like plants. They produce their own food through sunlight. And then next trophic level up would be like rabbits. They eat plant material. And then next up from that would be like kind of like mesopredators or predators that kind of hang out in the in-between zone. That they are typically omnivorous. They eat all kinds of stuff. So this is like coyotes and snakes and stuff. They eat rodents and those kind of things, but they can also be predated on by apex predators, which are red-tailed hawks, mountain lions, kind of the big scary stuff. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, speaking of apex predators, the most charismatic of megafauna in our region is the mountain lion. These are some mountain lion cubs, and they're adorable at this stage in their life. Just kidding, they're cute all the way through. But mountain lions in Santa Susana and Santa Monica Mountains have already experienced significant population decline and bottlenecking which is the dramatic reduction in genetic diversity due to population decline or severe habitat fragmentation and isolation. Contaminants found at SSFL that act as endocrine disruptors can further compound issues with decreasing genetic diversity and inbreeding. So this includes deformities, infertility, non-viable offspring, miscarriages, and lower life expectancies. Contaminants from Santa Susana Field Laboratory that impact the effectiveness of the immune system will undoubtedly further impact this population that is already declining due to anticoagulant rodenticides and mange. All right, next slide. Thank you. Oh, sweet. Love this bird. All right. So we're talking about endangered species. What we have up right here is a Leesbell's vireo, an absolutely adorable little bird that relies on riparian areas, coastal sage scrub, and upland habitats, kind of the in-between. So the surrounding area and watersheds of SSFL are home to at least 17 federally listed species. Insectivorous birds like the federally listed Leesbell's vireo, which we have up right here, coastal California gnatcatcher and southwestern willow flycatcher are dependent on healthy invertebrate populations, which can be significantly impacted by the contaminants found at the site. Bronton's milk vetch has critical habitat. It's an endangered plant species. It has critical habitat adjacent to the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. Heavy metals, radionuclides, and other harmful contaminants can cause low biomass accumulation, chlorosis, inhibition of growth and photosynthesis, altered water balance and nutrient assimilation and senescence in this species, and eventually, of course, plant die-off with senescence. The surrounding watersheds are also home to sensitive and endangered amphibian species like the arroyo toad, which I mentioned before, and the California red-legged frog, which are particularly sensitive to endocrine disruptors, metals, and waterborne contaminants. Next slide. All right. Greenwashing. So I think most of us have heard this term before, especially in today's times. We see a lot of companies that kind of put on this like environmentally friendly image just to kind of like put a screen in front of us to, you know, the destruction of the environment that they really are doing. And we see this with Boeing. We see just a couple of examples here. The big one, in a blatant attempt to appear as though Boeing supports local efforts to improve wildlife habitat, Boeing donated $1 million to the Wildlife Corridor Overpass project for the 101 freeway. This is an important project. Like, admittedly, this is an important project that will improve habitat, connectivity, genetic flow, dramatically reduce vehicle strikes, and reduce the harms to habitat fragmentation. However, this contribution of like $1 million is a drop in the bucket compared to the remediation Boeing is obligated to and required to complete at the Santa Susana Field Lab. The contaminants that remain at the Santa Susana Field Lab have had and continue to cause immense harm to local wildlife and the watersheds into which SSFL's discharge drains. So, I mean, they're doing more harm for the local communities, the local wildlife, local ecosystem, then they're offsetting by this, you know, chump change that they're throwing at a wildlife corridor. And we also see, like, on their website, you know, they have these like friendly like hikes and stuff that you can do at their site to see how good the population is doing. I think behind this sign here, they have some like invasive plants, so they're not even really upkeeping the site anyways. And then on their website, they're also talking about how this project, the remediation and cleanup of the site will have negative impacts on wildlife, and perhaps temporarily because they have to remove some vegetation or move some stuff around, maybe uplift some habitat. But the things that are there are being poisoned by hundreds of different contaminants that like I've said, have caused cancer and harm to reproductive health, and a number of other acute toxicity events. So let's move on. Next slide. This is just real quick. I know I've mostly focused on wildlife. It was my job tonight, but yeah, this is the relaxed cleanup standards that we're looking at in this MOU with the regional board are harmful for both humans and wildlife. Boeing's unwillingness to remediate Santa Susana Field Lab to the most protective standards will have severe consequences for local wildlife and endangered species. And then a quote from an expert ecotoxicologist that we've worked with, Frank von Hippel. If the property is not safe for people, then it certainly is not safe for much of the wildlife. And let's move on to, and this is of course a red-tailed hawk, one of the apex predators mentioned before. Next slide. All right, so I don't know why I did this, but I threw the most complicated slide at the end. So let me get through this. So talking about one of the switch ups that Boeing threw in here for us was taking out an NOAEL and throwing in an LOAEL. So to describe what these are, the NOAEL is the highest dose at which there was not an observed toxic or adverse effect. The LOAEL is the lowest dose at which there was an observed toxic or adverse effect. Now that's kind of some jumbled words thrown at you. So I'm going to try to hit you guys with an example. These aren't actual numbers, but I hope this will kind of help you guys understand. So let's say the NOAEL for lead toxicity in condors might be 2 ppm, because there would be no observed toxic effect at 2 ppm. The LOAEL for toxicity for condors could be 3 ppm, because this is the level where toxicity was first observed. So notice how the LOAEL is going to be a higher number. It's a higher concentration of this contaminant. And that's what really matters at the end of the day, right? If they're going with an LOAEL so they can have a higher concentration of contaminant. And it's just simply not protective of wildlife, because at that level, they're immediately seeing that there is some negative impact to the ecosystem and local ecology. So the most stringent and protective measures must be taken to protect sensitive wildlife and the surrounding ecosystems of the Santa Susana Mountains. As the MOU is written, harmful contamination of the site and surrounding water bodies will persist. Boeing has never and will never be able to comply with their NPDES permit without following through with the complete cleanup and remediation of this site. Thank you all for your time and for joining us tonight. I'm going to pass it off to Marissa Lopez.
Thanks so much, Tevin. Really appreciate you bringing your expertise. Marissa Lopez is a community member, and unfortunately, she is one of my fellow cancer moms.
Thanks, Melissa. Wow. So I've been sitting listening to this presentation, and yes, as a cancer mom, it's a lot to listen to. But I think I will share a little bit of our family's experience. In our presentation so far, you've seen the undisputed fact that the Santa Susana Field Lab is highly contaminated. It's a 130-acre waste site, and it's filled with literally tons of cancer-causing, immunosuppressing, forever, and radioactive chemicals. You've seen that proof, and it was signed in the 2007 and 2010 cleanup agreement that Boeing and Kelly EPA admitted that a thorough cleanup of the site was not only necessary for the safety of Ventura and LA County residents, but they also committed to cleaning up the site under their well-documented parameters by 2017. In this brief presentation, our panel of experts have shown some of the highly problematic safety contamination issues that will remain if the proposed new agreement and the new MOU paid for by a panel of Boeing water experts is allowed to stand. And this new agreement and MOU create a pathway to eliminate monitoring of the known contamination to our water and the reality of that contamination that will be left on the site. Besides the risk to animals and agriculture, the repercussions of not cleaning up the SSFL create significant health risks for Ventura and LA County residents for years to come. But what does that really mean? I think the easiest way for me to share what it means to me is to tell you a little bit about my connection to SSFL by our own family's personal experience. My hope is it will inspire you to take action in this fight, because no doubt about it, we are in a fight for our lives. We're in a fight for our children's lives. And honestly, we're in a fight for our future grandchildren's lives. Next slide. I'll start with a little bit of our background. Look at these pictures. Everything is kind of like set up before and after cancer diagnosis, right? I think you can relate. My husband and I were born and raised here in Ventura County. I'm a current property manager and a community partner, and I have a background in nonprofit and volunteer management. And my husband is an amazing fourth grade teacher and soccer coach. We worked hard, and we were finally able to purchase our own slice of the American dream, a cute little 1940s home at the base of the Conejo Grade in Camarillo in 2009. Take note of that location for later. We have two children, a 13-year-old son named Manny and my 17-year-old daughter, Layla, who have grown up and gone through Camarillo elementary, middle, and high schools. They're very active in sports and volunteering. They play soccer every season at the Pleasant Valley Fields, again, which is at the base of the Conejo Grade. We, like many of you, love to hike, go to the beach, and explore. In 2017, I first learned of SSFL and the former nuclear meltdown and forever chemical toxic site while seeing a post on social media. It was shocking to think of this happening in our own backyard. It even prompted me to search for a little bit online. And honestly, I was happy to see that there was a cleanup agreement in place. At the time, I thought that Boeing seemed like a supportive corporate partner who was saddled with the contaminated site from Rocketdyne, but they were doing their best to clean it up. And as a busy working mom, the contamination and meltdown at SSFL became a passing thought. I thought, oh, I'll research this later when I have more time. Next slide. Fast forward to 2018, the Woolsey Fire. If you were in Ventura or LA County at that time, the Wolseley Fire will forever be seared into our hearts. For our family, at the base of the Conejo Grade, just north of Newberry Park, there was so much smoke. In the first couple of days, I remember listening fervently to emergency managers and talking with friends who were worked at the county that were working in emergency management in the fire department. They said we should just stay inside and keep our windows closed. We did that. We followed the rules. But being that our home was built in the 1940s with the original single pane windows, there was no insulation. Smoke inundated our home for a few days. And I thought, gosh, maybe we should leave. I didn't yet know of the contamination in that smoke. And I really wish we did. I later learned the Woolsey Fire began on the SSFL property. Next slide. The red area is the burn and smoke area of the fire, and just under 100,000 acres burned. Our home was located right in the middle of the smoky area. Next slide. In an independent study conducted after the Woolsey Fire and published in the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity, they concluded some ash and dust collected from the Woolsey Fire zone and the fire's immediate aftermath contained high activities of radioactive isotopes associated with the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. The data showed that the Woolsey Fire ash did, in fact, spread SSFL-related radioactive microparticles. Next slide. Mike Recon's PSR-LA's Mikey Recon helped collect soil, ash, and dust studies for the independent studies, and the Parents versus SSFL spearheaded sample collection and served as a chain of command for the 360 samples collected you see on this slide. The most contaminated soil sites were in the Newberry Park area just south of my home. It makes sense because the wind was blowing our way during the fire. They did not test my neighborhood, but the wind spread the smoke in our direction, and we sat in this contaminated smoke for days. Just hold that thought for a moment. In 2020, just before the COVID lockdowns, I attended a LULAC volunteer meeting, and I first learned in more detail about the SSFL contamination and the Woolsey Fire in a bit more detail with a presentation actually from Melissa Bumstead. She shared her experiences with her daughter and the role SSFL plays in spreading carcinogenic toxins in our area. And I thought I should get involved with the movement a bit more, but with COVID and life that, happened that year, I put it in my to-do list for later. Next slide. In March of, this is hard to see, of 2021, we learned my daughter, Layla, had a devastating 1 in a million diagnosis of glioblastoma. Glioblastoma is a grade 4 terminal brain cancer, with most dying within 2 years or less of diagnosis, and 95% will die within 5 years. The only known cause for glioblastoma is radiation exposure. She is currently in treatment, and we are doing everything humanly possible to beat this horrible diagnosis. We've since learned that, quote unquote, beating it means living with it for the rest of her life. There is no such thing as any D, or I've learned that means no evidence of disease for glioblastoma patients. She will be in treatment or aggressively monitoring it for as long as she lives, which we hope is a really long time. For my daughter, beating it so far means 1 craniotomy. That's the brain surgery you see in that first picture, where they had to pull out as much of the tumors as possible. 1 port insulation surgery, 9 brain MRIs, 1 whole body MRI, 38 IV pokes. This is in the last 18 months. 2 emergency room visits, and 33 infusions so far. Even with all that, we're excited. We're beyond thrilled. She's in a phase 1 immunotherapy trial, and she's doing relatively well. We know we're breaking new ground. My daughter is a guinea pig in this phase 1 trial because there is no effective treatment so far for glioblastoma. While we have hope, there are still a lot of unknowns and no guarantees. Again, we have heard discussions in this presentation of carcinogenic pollutants, but what does that really mean? I am certain the contaminated smoke from the Wolseley Fire that my daughter was exposed to played a huge role in causing her brain cancer. For certain, without a real cleanup, contaminated water runoff, and who knows, we're in a fire zone, future smoke will cause cancer to many in our community and beyond. Anyone who drinks the water or eats our delicious produce grown locally will be affected. Nobody should have to go through this. And if it can happen to our family, it can definitely happen to yours. Next slide. What can we do about it? I can tell you, don't be like me and put it onto your to-do list for later. We need to show up at the Waterboard meeting, either in person or virtually. I, up until a few years ago, had never participated in making presentations or speaking at any of these kinds of meetings, but I've since learned it's really simple. It starts at 10 a.m. You can, you don't have to participate in that if you're working or you're not able to join for the entire meeting. You can visit the Parents Against Santa Susana Field Lab website and join the text thread, and we'll let you know when it's time for the public comments, because sometimes the meetings can go on. If you're like me, I want to hear everything they have to say, because it's honestly unbelievable and it's not right. But if you can't do that, it's so important that you show up. And showing up can again be by calling in or by showing up in person. And if you haven't made it a comment, it's usually less than 2 or 3 minutes. It's super simple. You can see on the slide there's some sample messaging that you can take. You can even take 30 seconds and say, I am against, 5 seconds and say, please look at the MOU. Please look at the safety of our water. It's your responsibility. You can keep it super simple, but I beg of you, I hope that you never have to go through what we have gone through. And I know that some of you on this call are going through it or have gone through it in the past. But we have to do everything. I'm calling all my family and friends, and I hope and I beg that each of you will take the time, will find the time, take some time off if you have to participate in the meeting, because without it, they will get away with it. You've seen the years that have gone through to get to the point that we're in right now, and this is our shot, another shot, hopefully, at making sure that Boeing cleans up the site to make sure that our family and our communities are safe. Thanks, Melissa.
Marissa, thank you so much. I would just like to applaud you for your bravery and courage to be here today, because I know how hard it is to show pictures of what you're going through and have to talk through the pain that your family is going through, and we will be praying for full recovery. And I believe that if there's anyone who's ready to break some statistics, it's going to be her. She's tough girl, and really proud of her for how far she's come. We're going to open up this time to Q&A. I apologize. I realize that the chat doesn't seem to allow the public to be entering questions that way. We will go through the Q&A. So if you see the Q&A button, I believe if we can try to raise your hand. And I'm hoping that I can unmute you if you would like to share questions. So I am going to read a few of the Q&As, and then we'll open those up to panel members who can help share their expertise to answer them. And again, I just want to thank all of our panel members today. Dr. Dodge, Marissa, Denise, Jeff, Kevin, Dan, you guys, I know how busy you are and how important your work is, and the fact that you took the time to be with us tonight just means so much. And I hope you know how much we appreciate that. Let's see. I'm reading more. Okay, Michaela, hi, good to see you, has a question. What can we do to prevent the polluters from getting out of the agreed upon cleanup agreement? I'm concerned that the Waterboard will not rule in our favor. I will be speaking at the Waterboard meeting. We will all be meeting in person and carpooling, ? Actually, we will not be carpooling just because the COVID rates are going up right now. If you are vaccinated and want to reach out to me personally, maybe we could talk about it, but we were thinking about getting a van. We're not going to, but really, really would appreciate your attendance, especially in person if you can. That always makes a big difference. And I'm going down here. We have a question from Ksenia and asking where the multiplier numbers came from. So Dan, is that something that you would like to go back into about how you found out about the multipliers? And if you need me to go to a slide, just let me know.
So have you ever heard the phrase air grab? They grabbed it out of thin air. So they did a closed press conference to release to a select group of reporters on an embargoed basis, meaning they couldn't talk to anybody on the other side. And they didn't release the agreement. So the reporters didn't even have the 800-page document to thumb through. We eventually got it a few hours later. And I was able to very quickly find, buried into the document, about 200 pages in, the multiplier 5. And then on a single page, and we showed you what that looked like, a flow chart, and they showed the less than 10 to the minus 4. So that's the factor of 100, but no one in the general public would ever know that. No decision maker would know it. So they buried it in the document, and it took us to be able to find it quickly. You remember there was a famous song during the Depression, A Pretty Boy Floyd by Woody Guthrie. In the song, Guthrie says that some people rob you with a 6-gun, others with a fountain pen. So in our era, some people kill you with a 6-gun. Other people kill you with burying a number in a document that they don't want anyone to be able to look through. That's how the deaths occur nowadays.
I can also add that the settlement agreement is available on the Parents Against SSFL website. I believe we have links to it. You can also go to the DTSC website. And if you look at page 192 of the PDF, that starts the discussion where you'll see them list out that multiplier. But again, the thing that's brilliant about Dan and his team at Committee to Bridge the Gap is they more than anyone, Dan has taught me to, how do I say it nicely? For me to stop being so naive when it comes to polluters, and to really be aggressive in checking the facts. And so, I always applaud Dan for being the one to find these things that they thought nobody else would, they didn't even think that he would be able to find it. And of course he did. And we're so grateful, because these are the small little sentences that completely flip the cleanup. And this is not the first time Boeing has tried this. They also did it, I believe, in 2013 or 15, where they tried to rename a residential garden and put out a much more lethal cleanup. Julie is asking, where is the Waterboard meeting? Is actually in the Santa Clarita Town Hall, I believe. That information, again, if you go to our website, Parents Against SSFL, you'll see an events tab. Click that, and it has all the information for you there. Allison is asking, how do we speak virtually at the board meeting? I just registered via the link you shared. I'm not sure if that is just to observe. According to what they said, that should be a link that when you get into the meeting, you'll be able to raise your hand virtually, or similar to this Q&A, put your name into the queue where you will be called on. And if you don't have time to watch the whole meeting, because sometimes they have an hour presentation before they open up to public comments, again, if you join our text thread, sign up for that, we will let you know like 15 minutes before they're saying get ready for the comments. I'm looking now to see if we have any raised hands. I don't know that we do. Can anyone else in my group see, do we have any raised hands from the public? Or any Q&As that we want to have come in? Let me see if we missed any. Okay, someone's saying that the text alerts couldn't find the page. That's my fault. I'm sorry. We're going to send out an email to everyone who attended. We will have all the correct links. We'll have the Reuters story. We'll have the a link to the documentary and the text alerts and all the information for the MOU. Jeni and I are also available for anyone who would like to make a public comment but doesn't know what to say. We'd be happy to look it over for you or practice it with you. Just let us know how we can help you feel most comfortable. But like Marissa said, it's a little nerve-wracking the first time, but then you realize real quick it's actually very simple. we're looking again, someone said get more agencies involved. It is the math. I'm not exactly sure what that means. So if anonymous attendee would like to clarify, please feel free down below. John Armstrong, thank you for joining us. Always good to hear from you. There, yeah, John's gone through a lot with dealing with contamination from living nearby. So as far as what I see right now, it looks like we have, okay, is there any advice that can be given regarding bathing water or water filtering the whole house? That's a question we get often. Dan, is that something, or Jeni, would you like to take that question? Or you've got your hand raised?
Well, I would like to give an opinion about it after Dan gives his expert response.
Dan,
I know nothing about bathing. I do it only once a year, whether I need it or not. I'm the wrong person to ask about how to protect yourself from bath water, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I have sparklets delivered for our cooking water. I called Dan. Dan, I don't know if you remember this. We talked before we ever started doing this work together. And we talked about reverse osmosis as a possibility for removing things besides things like tritium. The issue with that is that we priced a system at $4,000 for the house. That becomes an environmental justice issue. Not all people can afford that. And that is something I think we can address in comments. We are not all able to afford that to protect ourselves, and nor should we have to. So it's not that you can't clean your water, but the water that we already pay for coming into the house should be sufficient and should not be at risk of being contaminated from the site. So if they remediate the site, we'll be able to bathe our kids without worrying about it so much.
Dan, go ahead.
I shouldn't have been joking about it. Look, you should not have to worry about the water coming into your house. Boeing should not be polluting that water. The Department of Toxic Substances Control should be requiring the cleanup of the soil that's polluting the water, and cleanup of the groundwater that's migrating into groundwater basins that are being used for drinking purposes. The Regional Water Board should be controlling things. There are over 300 toxic chemicals and radionuclides at Santa Susana that have been detected there. And the Water Board is only regulating a handful of those. And those handful, they now are proposing to stop regulating at all for Boeing, to simply let it do whatever it wants without any control. You shouldn't have to worry about trying to spend thousands of dollars on a reverse osmosis system so that your child taking a bath, you aren't worried about at risk. And we can't afford those things. So buying some under the sink reverse osmosis systems for your drinking water, it's probably prudent. Anything beyond that, I urge you to put your energy into trying to get the site cleaned up. That's how we protect ourselves and everybody else. You remove the contamination from the source, you get the polluter to be held responsible, and you get the agencies to start behaving the way they're supposed to rather than be captured by the polluter they're supposed to regulate. You should not have to worry about taking a bath.
Definitely agree. Jeni, jump in.
As we were discussing earlier, if the settlement agreement is approved through the approval of the MOU and the mitigation measures that are in place, the BMPs atop the site are removed, that could allow more contamination to flow into the Arroyo Simi. We have been privileged to be given some information. There's a consideration underway that might take water from the Arroyo Simi and replenish aquifers used for agriculture in Oxnard. This is one of the biggest reasons we need to clean up the site, because if the site is not remediated and they all walk away, the use for the water is throughout both counties. For recreation, drinking water, agriculture use, then the farm workers get involved. Then that strawberry that somebody had mentioned, you know, it doesn't stop unless we remediate it. So if you can let everyone that you know that this is something that potentially affects all of our families and friends in the area, and to just urge the board to vote no and get this MOU rejected.
Okay, I'm gonna say Dan and then Julie.
So I want you to understand what's before the water board on August 11th. If they approve it, that means that even the minimal controls that now exist at the site will be lifted, and they can release pollution in unlimited amounts for the rest of eternity. So it's as bad as it is now. If they approve the MOU, the amount of contamination leaving that site would skyrocket. So I urge you, testify at the hearing, do it remotely or in person. Don't worry if you haven't done it before. We will help in advance if you are in touch with us, which I'll mention in a moment, so that you can do this. If we're effective enough on August 11th, this agreement won't go into effect and they'll be forced to have to do a genuine cleanup. So I don't know exactly what, Melissa, you've arranged, but I want those of you who are on this line to one way or another sign up, not just with the water board to speak, but with Melissa and Jeni to coordinate what you're going to deal with in advance so they can help you. If that means emailing Parents Against SSFL as this meeting closes, saying, I want to testify, please help me. They'll be in touch with you. You can help write something so you can read it, or you can at least talk through what you want to say. But if you sat through 2 hours of this meeting, learning how bad things are, and you won't spend 2 minutes testifying, you aren't really protecting yourself or your families. You shouldn't have to do this. Boeing and the regulators should be doing their job. But that's not how the world works. The world works by people of conscience doing the right thing. And you have that conscience. Please be in touch with Melissa and Jeni to let them know that you'll speak and speak out. I want to just end my statement with a quote from Camus that I have always loved very much. He said that what the world expects of people of conscience is that they speak out loud and clear, so that not the slightest doubt can arise in the heart of the simplest person. What we need are people willing to speak out clearly and pay up personally. So I ask you to not just have sat through this and listened and learned, but now convert that into doing something that can protect your families and others by arranging to coordinate with Melissa and Jeni to speak on the 11th. We can beat Boeing and the captured regulators on the 11th if we do this well enough.
And I'll just add to that, because some of the people on this call are great at speaking at our past events and making public comments. So my challenge to you is, if you already know how to make a public comment, go find someone around you who is not, who you can bring to this meeting virtually or personally. That's your challenge. Is a little different. Is take a step further, go bring someone with you who can also speak out and help either connect them with us or help them know what to say so they can also come to the MOU meeting. I'm going to say right now that it's 8:30. I know that we have 2 more questions. We might try to give quick answers possibly. But I'm going to ask that you keep your question, Julie, and then also Brianna, to under a minute, so that way we can wrap this up and we'll all get some rest, because I know some people like Dan, they just never stop, which I admire so much. And yet we got to make sure we all get some rest too. He's been working really hard all day to protect us. Do you need to be a resident to speak at the water board meeting? That's a really good question. Well, I think it would be preferred if you were a resident of Ventura County or Los Angeles, but I don't think it's a requirement.
It's not required. They don't ask you your address. Anyone should speak. This affects a large, it's one of the most contaminated sites in the country.
Yeah.
Anyone who you can get to speak, you should arrange to, so long as it's a fairly clear message from them.
Yeah, and also anyone who cares about the environment, anyone who cares about animals, anyone who cares about children's health, anyone who cares about public health. They have a good reason to call in to the MOU. So Julie, go ahead, 1 minute for your question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. I have to always first thank each and every one of you for everything that you have been doing. You know, I've been involved with this issue for over 30 years now, and I learn something new every time, and every time you speak. What I wanted to just recommend and suggest that whoever does speak or go in person, that very simplistic examples are given. What I learned tonight, well, two things. One, about Simi Valley water and it being in the wells, the runoff. I knew about that, but I had never really realized that some of the tributaries go all the way to Oxnard into the farm fields and the strawberries. I mean, that was an eye opener. Many of you that spoke tonight, it's very technical information. It's good to have you speak as well, but I really believe the mothers of the children that have come down with cancer, that is just the most impressive words that I have ever heard. If it gets too technical, the board will roll their eyes and, you know, bleep out. So if you know, I would just say simple examples. The strawberry example to me was just riveting. Thank you so much for all the work and research that you've all done.
Thanks so much, Julie. And you're right. It can be, I think, from the technical people who are able to teach, that helps the water board come along. But I think for the rest of us, our personal stories are powerful. And sometimes we don't realize how powerful they are. Okay, last question is from Brianna, who has a horse who boards in Moore Park, and that ranch uses well water. Can contamination get that far, and how do we test it? So Brianna, because that goes through the Cayugas Creek watershed, it certainly has the potential to reach that far. Whether it's reaching it in with what type of contaminants and to what degree, I'm not sure. Does anyone want to take a jump on that? Or otherwise, I think what we might have to do is a little bit of research with you, Brianna, and figure out how we can help you to figure that out, make sure your horse is safe. Tevin, do you have your hand raised for this question or different?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. There's probably not direct connectivity, like groundwater connectivity between the aquifer that they, or the well that they pull water from in Moore Park, and the one that discharge from SSFL that seeps into groundwater. That's probably not geologically connected. However, the surface flows from the Arroyo Simi leach into and naturally recharge groundwater. That naturally recharged groundwater could have contaminants in it. There is some like natural cleaning because it goes through many porous sediments and rocks and all that stuff to get into that aquifer. So I really wouldn't be too concerned about contaminants being in there. There could be from SSFL, especially after the Woolsey Fire. We just had massive amounts of contaminants getting into stuff like that. But I think the main concern really, when we talk about Santa Susana Field Laboratories, is like the surrounding communities. We heard from Marissa and Melissa tonight, and impacts to human health and environmental justice. Yeah, I think that's where I think our focus needs to be, and really standing up to Boeing and making sure the Regional Water Quality Control Board, does its job in protecting the community.
Yeah, and Tevin, you shared that quote from Dr. Von Hippel that said, if it's not safe for humans, it's probably not safe for wildlife either. So when we get the cleanup working the way it should, then we won't have to ask these kind of questions like, is the people, the animals, the things that I love, are they in danger? So I think we're going to wrap it for tonight. Again, thank you for all of you. We have 31 attendees who stuck through over 2 hours of some pretty technical talk. I admire each of you greatly for doing that. and it just really shows your investment into the community. This has been recorded. It will be made public, and please feel free to share it with any of your friends and family who might, need to hear the technical answers. We look forward to working with you guys on the MOU. We've got a lot of great foundations, organizations, NGOs that are also going to be standing with us in solidarity to demand the full cleanup, the safest. They're saying that they had to change to the settlement agreement because it wasn't best science. We're saying that's really Boeing science isn't best science, but most health protective. That's what we want. We want the most health protective cleanup, which is not the settlement agreement. It's a 2007 agreement. And we want the water to be protected. And that comes with having a permit. All right, everyone. I hope you had a great night. I hope you were able to learn a lot. And I wish you all well. Take care.